This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the USEA podcast series on the future of energy policy, we're going to talk about what to expect under the new presidential administration and Congress as changing resources, spiking electricity demand, and extreme weather events add unprecedented stress to the U.S. power system. Former Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, Chair Neil Chatterjee is going to discuss what could happen to existing and new incentives and policies and the clean energy resources they support. Neil was appointed FERC Chair by President Trump in 2017 and served until 2021. He began his career as a congressional policy advisor and as the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association's principal legislative advocate, and then served as policy advisor to Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell from 2009 to 2017. Currently, he's Chief Government Affairs Officer for global software and distributed resources provider Palmetto. So, Neil, there are controversies over administrative actions to impound funds and review rules, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. But assuming we get past those debates, do you think the IRA tax credits and other policies for utility scale and distributed resources are going to be subject to significant change in this new administration? A reduction in compensation, an acceleration of the phase out, a change in the requirements for domestic content? Or do you think the new leaders will recognize the importance of the IRA benefits all their states?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's something that everybody in the energy sector is currently focused on. Look, in my view, I think that the IRA, it was passed along partisan lines, not necessarily because of the underlying substance of the legislation, which was really all carrots and no sticks. It was the manner in which it was enacted. Now, this is a little bit wonky, technical, procedural stuff, but your audience, can appreciate it.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was
go.
enacted. It was enacted via budget reconciliation, which is an inherently partisan legislative tool designed to circumvent the filibuster and the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. And because of that, it is a naturally partisan approach, and therefore every member of the minority party votes against it when the reconciliation measures are used. So that is why every Republican voted against the package that contained the IRA, not necessarily because of the underlying provisions. And that gives me some sense of optimism that, a lot of the key credits can be preserved. Now, not all of them. I think, clearly, the EV credits, offshore wind, onshore wind, I think are likely to see a lot of pressure. But I think the bulk of the credits that, will really, help contain inflationary pressure, bring down the cost of electricity for consumers, are likely to receive some support. And I think, look, it's early right now. We're in February. It's the early days of a new administration. And a lot of the focus has been thus far on what President Trump campaigned on: American energy dominance, drill, baby, drill, promotion of fossil fuels. And that's to be expected. That's how he governed the last time, and that's what he campaigned on. And he
Mm-hmm.
won, a decisive mandate.
Mm-hmm.
That said, President Trump made two promises to the American people when it came to energy. One was to win the AI race for national security purposes against the Chinese Communist Party, and two was to bring down the cost of electricity. And I think that as his administration gets seated, as folks come in and the policy takes shape, and they will recognize quickly that in order to achieve those two things, to win the AI race, which will require a tremendous amount of power to support the data centers necessary to gird AI, in order to win that race and also keep electricity affordable and reliable, we're going to need every available electron. You cannot possibly win the AI race and bring down the cost of electricity with fossil fuels alone. And so that means technologies like solar, and storage and geothermal and nuclear, I think are going to receive support. And as you look at those suite of tax credits, I actually do believe that there will be leaders in Congress and, quite frankly, within the administration who will recognize that we need not throw the baby out with the bathwater, that there's value in some of these incentives, and that actually, on a dollar for dollar basis, eliminating some of these incentives may actually, kind of undercut some of the value of the proposed tax cuts that their rescission would seemingly offset.
Well, we're gonna dig into a lot of what you just said. We're gonna dig in a little bit deeper. I want to start with one question. There was a flurry of development activity in November and December of last year because there's a provision that things that get started will have a long-term access to their credits. So assuming the rules and reviews and funding impediments are resolved, will the construction started on those mini projects protect them and their tax credits over the next 4 years? And essentially, will the need to meet load growth at low prices, which is what those mini projects could potentially do, will that protect investment in those and other resources, even if the incentives change a little bit?
You know, I haven't had the opportunity to review all of those projects, so I can't, speak to them writ
Sure.
large, right? In terms of, what projects, move forward, look, we're in a transitionary place. People always look with skepticism at moves that are made in between presidential transitions. And if it's seemingly an effort to get out ahead of a change in policy, that may be subject to some scrutiny. We'll see what the legalities around it are. Again, not knowing the specific projects you're referring to, I'm reluctant to kind of comment on those, package of projects that started in the transition period. What I will say writ large, though, is I think people in Congress, Republicans in Congress, as well as in the incoming administration, do recognize that as the business case for clean energy has improved and continues to improve, and as customer choice comes more into focus, there's a lot of appeal in these technologies. Look, one of the reasons I came to Palmetto, quite frankly, is because I really believe in the business model. There are financial products that will make solar more accessible. The economic case for the savings that solar and storage and heat pumps and HVAC and smart plugs can bring to consumers at a time when electricity bills are really high is something that's enticing to consumers. And then finally, there's a reliability piece to this, with companies like Palmetto and their software platform and all that it provides. You answer a lot of the questions about, reliability as well. And I think, this is very much a sort of populist working class approach to energy that I think has a lot of appeal to the president's base and to voters who put Republicans in power in both the House and the Senate. And so as I look across the array, I remain bullish on the future for clean technology, but unfortunately, I can't speak to those specific projects you're referring to.
Okay. I understand that. But as you said in your answer to the first question, we're facing enormous load growth, and these resources, they're not only popular, but they also are, in many cases, the lowest priced resources. So that's going to be a lot of appeal. But let me move on. I want to talk just a minute here about the problems or the challenges at hand. There's been these multiple initiatives from the new administration to review and rescind leases, approvals, funding for distributed and utility scale renewables and other resources, especially, as you mentioned earlier, onshore and offshore wind. Could you tell us a little bit of how you see what's going on in those sort of uh, pauses, if you will, and tell us what you see as the potential impacts? And most importantly, do you think what's going on in the early days of the administration could re re retard the US's ability to meet this big load growth?
So I think, to answer your first question, some of this is typical in presidential transitions. When a new administration comes in, they review the outgoing administration's policies and proposals to see what aligns with their objectives and what potentially doesn't. I think some of the things being discussed here, in terms of the freeze and the reviews, really is kind of business as usual, and there's been a lot
Mm,
more made about it than I think was necessary. That said, some of the questions that have come about, regarding, say, impounding funds that have already been allocated by Congress, that's where I think the tug and pull between the executive branch and the legislative branch will come into play. Look, I worked for an appropriator for almost a decade. I know that members of the Appropriations Committee take their authority and take their responsibility quite seriously. And even in instances where it may seem politically appealing, I think there will be members of the Congress who will kind of want to pump the brakes on this. To me, looking at impounding funds that had been appropriated by a previous administration, by a previous Congress, it's sort of, to me, like abolishing the legislative filibuster. It's
mm.
when you have control all the levers of power, it seems like an attractive thing to do, but you may regret it very quickly, because then it will be used against you when the other party gets all the levers of power. I am very much a staunch supporter of the legislative filibuster, and I think, quite frankly, it prevented a lot of bad policy from getting done the last 4 years. And I'm thankful that Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema and others stepped up to protect the filibuster. I would similarly commend my former Republican colleagues to not make short-term steps that may seem appealing in the moment, but might have longer-term ramifications. So we'll see, but I think the appropriators will stand up for their jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think in some cases it seems like it's going to be hard for some of these folks in Congress to go back to their districts and say they voted against things that produce so many jobs and so much tax revenue for their localities. But um, I want to get one more question in, Neil, before we let you go. Um, and you mentioned Senator Manchin. Some studies show it's local and not federal permitting and regulatory impediments that are slowing deployment of transmission and generation. Now, the Manchin-Barrasso bill to streamline permitting failed last year. Do you think there's going to be new FERC or congressional action on permitting and regulatory reform to strengthen electric system reliability? And if you think it's coming, how do you think it's going to be presented?
My former colleagues at FERC are trying, and have done yeoman's work in this area. But you noted it, like a lot of times it is that local opposition that frustrates development, because the reality is NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, is not political. It's not ideological. Americans don't want energy infrastructure coming through their yards, whether it's a pipeline to deliver gas or a transmission line to deliver clean energy. And when I was at FERC, I had some of my former state regulatory colleagues approach me quietly and say, Neil, we would love it if FERC could just roll us, because that's the only way we'll get this infrastructure sited. But I
Mm,
can't say that aloud. I'll be eviscerated in my community. And my response was, hey, well, that's not fair. Why are you going to put it on me? I might want to go to your community someday. I want to take vacations. Why should I be the bad guy that has to
better
do
you than them, though, right? That's politics, right?
and so that therein lies the challenge, and that's why I think it is not realistic to think that FERC has the authority to solve all these problems on their own. I do think it will take national leadership. I do think it will take, federal legislative permitting reform to get done. To me, there is a deal to be had here that will better facilitate the build out of natural gas pipeline and gas infrastructure in the short run to maintain reliability and affordability, and enable the build out of transmission lines so we have a grid of the future for the long term. And I think there's something in it for all sides. But I tend to think big policies like this, they have their best chance in divided government, because when you have divided government and both sides have to negotiate and compromise, you can kind of land some of these deals. And that's why I was, so optimistic that Senators Manchin and Barrasso were leading on this, and I commend them for leading on this. It does get a little bit trickier when one side controls all the levers, because there's not, sort of that willingness to negotiate and compromise And the reality is, look, Republicans are not going to abolish the filibuster to pass permitting reform, right? And so, in the absence of that, you're going to need at least all, 7 Senate Democrats to come with all Senate Republicans on a package that could also pass the House. And I just don't know how motivated folks will be to come together on this. It's so important, and you've got leaders on the Energy Committee, both Senator Lee and Senator Heinrich, I think, are really smart, gifted negotiators who maybe could come together and resuscitate the good work that Barrasso and Manchin started. But to be totally candid, at least in this environment where Republicans can control all the levers of power, I don't know that the Democrats will even be willing to come to the table to negotiate to get
Right,
something
right.
done.
Okay, Neil, I want to clarify one thing that you talked about. It's a big question. We don't have a lot of time left, but I'd like you to, if possible, simplify it. My understanding is that siting and permitting natural gas lines is different than siting and permitting transmission, that natural gas lines have some sort of a easier route. Can you clarify that just in passing?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about different statutes here, the Natural Gas Act and the Federal Power Act, and so the same, processes don't apply. There have been some who have called, for parity,
Yeah.
on long haul transmission lines. Look, that would take, a legislative change to effectuate. In the
Oh,
absence of that legislative change, FERC did what they could with FERC Order 1920 and 1920A to try to bring some more clarity to this process. But even the commissioners, in enacting it, understood it wasn't a silver bullet. You really do need legislative permitting reform from our
mm.
national leaders in Congress.
Well, I guess we're going to have to wait for that. Let's leave it there. I got to thank you. My guest has been former FERC Chair Neil Chatterjee, currently Chief Government Affairs Officer for global software and distributed resources provider Palmetto. He's provided us with really valuable insights into what to expect in the power sector under the new presidential administration and Congress as changing resources, spiking electricity demand, and extreme weather events add unprecedented stress to the U.S. power system. As always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.